Hi, I'm Joanne Chang, and I'm going to be talking to you about the basic science of baking bread. So first, let's go over the ingredients. This is a very, very basic, what we call a country loaf. I have water. I have yeast. This is compressed fresh yeast. A lot of times in the grocery store, you find the powdered stuff. They're the same thing, just one's in dry powdered form, and then this is in a soft, crumbly form. This is actually a sourdough starter. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second. I have two different kinds of flour. I have high gluten flour and I have all-purpose flour. And then finally I have a little bit of salt and a little bit of sugar. So what is a sourdough starter? A lot of times people say, oh my gosh, I went to San Francisco and I got a loaf of sourdough bread. I could never get that anywhere else. That's not true. You can make sourdough anywhere. You can't smell this, but I'm going to tell you, this smells wonderfully acidic and fermented. And I know that fermentation doesn't always sound like a good word, but when I say fermented, I mean like really rich and alive, because that's exactly what this is. This started out 13 years ago for us as flour and water that we mixed together in a bowl and we let it sit out. We let it sit out for a week. It got dry on the outside, as you can imagine it would. And I just basically let it sit and forgot about it for a week. A week later, I went and I peeled off that dry crust, and inside I had this. Now, how did that happen from just the flour and the water? Well, you might not know this, but in this air, there are natural yeasts that live in the air. We're breathing them. They're sitting on things that you don't even think about. And when you put flour and water together, and you have to make it so that it's kind of wet and slushy. If you have something that's really, really dry, it probably won't work. If you have something that's too wet, it might get a little bit moldy because there's also molds in the air. But if you have flour and water and you just leave them out on the countertop, then after a while, the yeasts that are in the air are going to come because there's sugar in flours. There's natural sugars and the yeast are going to come. And yeast love to eat sugar. And when I say yeast, I really mean these are little organisms. I mean, very, very little. And they fly around, and then when they find something they can eat, they go and they start eating. Now, as they start eating, they're just like people. They let out gas. They burp and they fart. And so as soon as they start eating, then they start to let out gas, and then what happens is things start to ferment. They get gassy. And so what we did 13 years ago was we created this big pile of flour and water. We let it sit. We peeled away that crust that formed. We took the insides, and then we started feeding it more flour and then more water. If you just feed it the flour, it starts to get really, really stiff, and then it can't grow again because it's too stiff. So you feed it more flour, more water, more flour, more water. If you feed it every day, eventually what starts off as like this wet, sludgy mass that has some yeast in it, after a while it ends up being full of natural yeast. So every single day, this is just a little quart container, but we have a huge bucket that we take from every day to make our bread, and then we feed it more flour and more water. We mix it all up, we let it sit out, and then it gathers more natural yeast, and then we put it in the fridge where it rests, and then the next day we start the whole process over again. So this I'm going to use in this basic bread. You don't have to use a sourdough starter when making bread at all. You can just use these ingredients. But for us, we like to use a sourdough starter because it really adds a lot of great flavor. The other thing I want to talk about is the two different types of flour. All-purpose flour is the flour that everybody knows about. You go to the grocery store and you buy a bag of flour, it's most likely going to be all-purpose. High gluten flour, actually at the grocery store you probably see something that's more like bread flour. And what this means is that it means it's very, very high in gluten, hence the name high gluten flour. So gluten is a protein that is in flour. There is gluten that is part of the flour. And gluten gets activated by water. And as soon as flour hits water, the gluten starts to get activated. So you can see it happening when you put flour and water together. As you start to mix it, first it's just kind of, it's like making mud pies, right? It's just kind of messy and nothing's really happening. And if you keep mixing and keep mixing, you start to see that it actually starts to get a little stretchy, kind of like rubber. It feels like there's rubber bands in there. And that's because the gluten is starting to get developed. And in a really great loaf of bread, you have a lot of gluten development. And that's what makes the bread chewy. Now, how does it make it chewy? Well, if you imagine you have all these long strands that are in your dough. When you put the dough into the oven, all of those yeasts, so we talked about the natural yeast, and then we also have compressed yeast. All of these yeasts, which are part of the eventual bread dough, as soon as you put them into the oven, they do one last hurrah because they're about to die. So they all get really, really active. The heat makes them move around really fast. They all burp and let out everything that they have, and then one big expiration, they die. But that's, even though it sounds horrible, what's really happening is your dough is going from a small, cold, hard lump of dough into the oven, and then all of the yeast are doing its thing, and all of the gases, which are trapped within the network of gluten, is what makes your bread rise. And then when you break open the bread, you should have really beautiful long strands of dough. So, to start off, we're just going to put water and then the yeast. I'm just going to let this sit just because sometimes it gets a little bit lumpy, so I just want it to combine and melt into the water. And then I'm going to take my sourdough. So do you know remember I was talking about the strands? Can you see that? Like, this is all glutinous strands. Uh-oh. It's not going to all make it into the bowl. I'm going to slowly get this going. Now remember, you got that sloshy, it's in the water, so it's getting a little bit sloshy, so I just make it go really, really low. And when it starts to mix in and dissolve into the water, I'll add the two flours. Now the salt and the sugar, what role do they play? I mean, they obviously, or maybe it's not obvious, but for me it's obvious, they play a really big flavor role. They add a lot of flavor. Every now and then one of our bakers forgets the salt in the bread, and it's so immediately obvious as soon as you bite into it. So the salt and the sugar add a little bit of flavor to the dough. But they actually also do a couple other things. The salt acts as a killer of yeast. And if you take, there's a reason why I'm going to add this last. If I take this and pour the salt directly in, it's going to start working against the yeast, and it'll start to kill all the yeast. The sugar is, as I was saying earlier, it's the food that the yeast feed on. And so if I add sugar, the more sugar I add, obviously the sweeter the dough, but also the more active the dough. So whenever you're working with a bread recipe, you're always trying to balance out and make negotiations, because if you want a sweet dough, then you know it's going to be really active. If you want a dough that's not salty, then you know that if there's no salt to inhibit the yeast, it's going to be very active. If you add too much salt to the dough, it's going to inhibit the yeast growth, and so you'll have a hard lump of bread. So there's always these kind of negotiations about how much salt, how much sugar. So I'm just going to show you the insides, even though there's not really that much to see. This is just the water, the sourdough starter, and then the natural yeast, the compressed yeast, all mixed together. Now I'm going to add the flour. And again, we have the mix of the two different flours, the all-purpose and the high gluten. I'm going to go ahead and give that a mix. And then I'm going to add my salt and sugar. And once it all comes together, I'll show it to you. So this is just the very beginnings of the dough. The flour's been mixed in, but there's really not that much gluten development. Can you see? It's very piecey. There's a little bit of gluten, like if I really look, I get a little bit, but that's probably from the sourdough starter that I had in there before. So it's mostly just clumpy pieces of dough. So now I'm just going to let the mixer do what's called kneading the dough. Not only is it mixing the sugar and the salt and the yeast and the sourdough starter and the water and the flour all together, it's obviously doing that, but the kneading of the dough is also helping to activate the gluten. So if you have gluten in your flour, it's activated by the presence of the liquid, but it's also activated by the action of kneading. And that's what the mixer is doing electronically, mechanically, so that I don't have to do the hard work to do it. As this goes in the mixer over a while, I'll show you what it looks like now. You can see that it's getting a little bit more, right? It's not quite as piecey as it was, but it's still pretty piecey. And you can see that the outside was also kind of shaggy looking. The more it works, the more the dough hook kind of works and kneads the dough, the smoother and smoother, and the more gluten will be developed within the bread. And it starts to take on a more smooth exterior, but that's going to take a little while. So now we've been kneading this dough for at least 5 or 10 minutes, and I'm going to show you how beautiful it is now that it's finished. Well, finished kneading. You can see the difference already, right, as I'm trying to take the dough hook. So I'll show it to you in the bowl, but then I'm going to take this whole thing out. And now you can see that what was a shaggy, piecey mess is actually full of gluten strands that are all stretchy. And in fact, if I try, I can even make a window pane. Can you see that? That's often a way that bakers will test to see if there's been enough gluten. If you can stretch it out enough so that you can get a little bit of a thin window pane, then you know you've been developing the gluten. Because if it's not developed enough, it'll instantly crack because it's too piecey. And you can see as I stretch it, and you can just see all the gluten. It's full of gluten. Okay, so this recipe is for 2 loaves of bread. I'm going to divide this dough in half. Now at this point, we've just worked it for about 10 minutes, and we can't really do anything with it right now because we've created all that gluten, and I've been talking about yeast and all the fermentation that needs to happen and all the carbon dioxide gas that has to happen, and now we need to give it time to actually let that happen. So what we do is we take the dough and we cover it. We lightly cover it, and then we let it rest. And as it rests, the yeast are going to start doing their thing. And that's when the dough is going to, what's called proofing in baking. And when I say proof, what happens is that the dough is starting to slowly relax, the gluten is starting to relax, and then all of the gases that are within the dough are starting to take action. And they're going to start to poof up and make this dough really light and stretchy. I happen to have a swap out right here. So this is dough that was made earlier today. And I don't know if you can really see, but there's tons of gas bubbles. Like here's a really good one that have started to grow. So I'm going to work with this piece of dough. And now I'm going to shape the dough. Now in shaping the dough, all I'm really doing is giving the dough a little bit of guidance in terms of how I want it to continue to grow. And you can see that now there's been such lovely gluten development that I'm able to create this really beautiful skin on the top of the dough. And if I let this sit here, you can actually start to see some of the bubbles. Can you see that as the gas is, because now the dough is full of gas. And for the last step of this, I've just shaped this beautiful loaf of bread, which you can see is already starting to be full of little air pockets. And I'm going to let it sit out for at least 2 or 3 hours. And as it sits at room temperature, all of the yeast are going to start doing their thing again, and this is going to actually almost double in size. And it's going to be light and full of air, and it'll actually even feel like a water balloon. That's how I tell my bakers when they know it's ready. Is when you gently lift it, it feels like a water balloon because it's that kind of full of air. Once I do that, the other important thing actually is you want to make sure that you cover this. So you take, after you've shaped it, you take a piece of plastic or a lint-free cloth and you cover it. Otherwise, if you don't cover it, it's going to be exposed to the air, and then it's just going to dry out and crust over. And then all of those yeast that are trying to make the dough grow won't be able to do anything, and they're just going to stay inside. So make sure you cover the dough. The temperature that you proof this loaf is very important. Well, you definitely don't want to proof it in an area that's too warm. If you proof dough in an area that's too warm, what will happen is I mentioned earlier that the yeast, they die at high heat. They will start to die on their own, and it won't be, you won't have a beautiful loaf anymore. If you proof this in an area that's too cold is actually much better than too warm, because too warm, what happens is you could actually kill the yeast. But too cold, what happens is the yeast just fall asleep. They go and they take a nap, and they don't do anything. They don't eat anything, they don't let out any gas, and nothing really happens. So if you have a loaf of bread and you don't have time to stick around for 2 or 3 hours and then bake your bread, what you can do is what's called retarding. You can put the loaf in the fridge and let it slow down and stop. And then when you're ready, you take it out. And then the best temperature for proofing dough is about 75 degrees. 75, 78 degrees is like the ideal temperature, and that will proof this dough. It'll double in size. And I'm just going to use this piece and pretend like it's doubled in size. And then, this has nothing to do with science, but it's a really nice thing that we do with the bread. If you just put it in the oven like this, all of the yeast are going to grow, the bread is going to start to cook, and then what's going to happen is there's going to be a little bit of a crust that forms, it's going to slowly start to brown, and then the insides are going to grow and pop open, and you'll end up with like little pockets of inside dough coming out. So what we do is we do what's called slashing, and I have a knife here, and we're basically guiding where we want the yeast and the dough to grow. So a very common pattern is, I call it the plant. Some of my staff call it the marijuana leaf. I think it's a plant. You go straight down, and they cut straight down, and then you do 2 little angles there and 2 little angles there. Let me turn this around so you can see it. And that way, when this dough goes into the oven, as it starts to grow, as it starts to bake, as it starts to get bigger, there's already pre-scored cuts that tell the bread how to grow. And then what you end up with is this. So that's the science of bread.